Recently, I saw this video on YouTube about the possibility of a Catholic marriage of conjoined twins. I found Jimmy's answers to be going in the right direction. However, in my opinion, they fall well short. That's why I commented on this.
Carmen Andrade married her boyfriend. Her twin sister, Lupita, approved of the marriage despite identifying as asexual and aromantic, and despite the fact that they share the same reproductive system. How would that work with the conjoined twin not being part of the sacraments since they share a body?
Okay, so the first thing to say is the Catholic Church does not have an official teaching on this. Thus far, I'm not aware of any church document, any magisterial document that addresses this issue. And so when that happens, we have to fall back on the principles of Catholic moral theology to form an opinion.
So, at first, I'm a bit puzzled that moral theology is brought into this because the argument that follows is almost entirely based on canon law. But I'll also bring moral theology into it later.
But the presumption is going to be in favor of a marriage being valid and thus possible. But there can be things that can overcome that. Like I mentioned, in this case, she's able to exchange matrimonial consent with him, and he's able to exchange matrimonial consent with her. So under ordinary circumstances, if you have two distinct individuals who exchange matrimonial consent, they're going to be married. The question is there anything that could block the marriage from coming into existence? And here, it seems to me there are two potential sources of concern. If Carmen marries this gentleman, then he and she are both going to be exposed to what's effectively an eavesdropper on their marital intimacy. Mm-hmm. And that's something that is a source of concern. And so I can see easily someone saying, well, this is not an ideal situation and this is an unpleasant situation. But is that lack of idealness, is that lack of pleasantness sufficient to overcome Carmen's right to get married?
Canon law says that, in principle, anyone can marry as long as there are no obstacles that make it impossible. So, generally, there's a presumption in favor of validity as long as no obstacles are shown. The two sisters are separate persons, so Carmen could, in principle, validly marry since both can express their free will. On that point, I completely agree with Jimmy. The first problem he raises is that Lupita, so to speak, listens in during intimacy, and this is seen as disturbing. But the question is whether that's serious enough to prevent the marriage, and he thinks it isn't, especially since she consents.
And I would be hard-pressed to say it fundamentally overcomes it and means Carmen can never get married. I'd also note that Lupita supports Carmen getting married. Mm-hmm. So that's not a source of concern here. And so if you've got one sister saying, I don't have a problem with this, and the other sister saying, I want to exercise my right to get married, the mere discomfort of the situation is something that I would be hard-pressed to say it's going to overcome Carmen's right to get married.
And here's where I already see the first problem with the argument. We're not talking about in-laws or kids sleeping in the same room while the couple is having sex, maybe even at the foot of the bed, as was common in the past, but about the fact that they could never be alone together. And the third person here isn't a passive spectator, but physically connected. So there are always three bodies, always three people involved in such an act. The marital act, according to Catholic teaching, is both unitive and procreative and requires exclusivity. If a third person is unavoidably present, even passively, then the conditio sine qua non of marriage cannot be fulfilled. This isn't just a less than ideal situation, as Jimmy argues, but a fundamental impossibility, because the body of one spouse would never be exclusively available to the other. The third person isn't a passive observer. Even if they say they don't feel anything from the sexual organs, they're still systemically connected. They're still physically involved. If it were only a relatively superficial connection between the twins, one might argue that way, and in that case, a surgical separation would also be relatively simple, and the problem wouldn't exist at all. But if it's a situation where separation would be medically extremely difficult, if not life-threatening, then we're dealing with closely connected systems. That most likely means shared blood vessels, nervous systems, and so on, endocrinologically connected as well. And here we see that even without any psychological or sexual sensation, the third person is still physically affected by the marital act through hormone flow, increased blood pressure, and so on.
Do you know what the human body goes through when you have sex? Pupils dilate, arteries constrict, core temperature rises, heart races, blood pressure skyrockets, respiration becomes rapid and shallow. The brain fires bursts of electrical impulses from nowhere to nowhere, and secretions spit out of every gland. And the muscles tense and spasm like you're lifting 3 times your body weight.
So it's physically unavoidable that a third person is involved in the marital act. That's clearly more than just an undesirable situation.
Now, the other source of concern is the mention that the two siblings, the two conjoined twins, share the same reproductive system. And that's important because for two reasons. One of them is, having children. Whose child will they be, Carmen's or Lupita's? But it also is of concern because in order to validly get married, as part of matrimonial consent, you have to consent to the right to intimate relations with the person you're marrying. And that implies that you have the ability to engage in intimate relations with the person you're marrying. Well, okay, so Carmen is going to need to give her husband or her fiance at this stage the right to have intimate relations with her. And that means that whose reproductive tract this is ultimately important, because I doubt very much now, especially without doing a cell by cell level genetic comparison, I doubt very much that the statement that they share the same reproductive system is true.
So imaging techniques could give some clues here. I wouldn't rely on genetic analysis at all in this case, since conjoined twins are usually genetically identical.
So if it turns out that this is really Carmen's reproductive system, then she has the ability to consent to marital intimacy with her fiance and they could get married. And if the reproductive system is really Lupita's, then Carmen cannot consent to marital intimacy with her fiance and they can't get married. So I think that that is a potential block.
And here I find that too technical and short-sighted. Jimmy more or less reduces the transfer of rights over the body to the spouse to just the sexual organs. Strictly speaking, that's somewhat correct, since this transfer pertains to the marital act. And yet, since he already mentioned moral theology before, moral theology and sacramental theology actually speak here of total self-giving. It has to be exclusive, body and soul. But if someone is inseparably connected, then there can never be just a couple. While Jimmy reduces the problem to the sexual organs and sees that as the real issue, I think the problem would also exist if another vital organ or major system were involved. In all cases where separation is more or less impossible. Canonically, Canons 1057 and 1084 are relevant. Consent makes the marriage, but that consent has to be realizable in the ability to consummate it. The reference to an analogous problem, impotence, is correct here. And strictly speaking, it's not about control over the whole body, but about the real possibility of carrying out the marital union. However, even if we set aside the moral theological idea of total self-giving, even if we limit ourselves solely to the marital act, the marital act never concerns only the sexual organs. And if the twins are, for example, connected through their circulation, then one sister depends on the same bloodstream that the other sister, so to speak, makes available to her husband during intercourse. So it's not self-disposal in the sense of transferring the right over one's own body to the spouse. If someone can't dispose of their own body exclusively because another is involved, they can't give it away exclusively either. And we see that too in how the analogous question of impotence is interpreted. For the problem of impotence, it doesn't matter whether it's due to the absence of sexual organs, brain damage, or spinal cord injury. As long as it's permanent, impotence is an impediment to marriage. The church sees the person as a whole, even if the transfer of rights over the body concerns the marital act. If the twins were only connected at neutral body parts that don't affect the marital act at all, one could canonically argue that impotence in that sense doesn't exist. The question is, which body parts could really be considered neutral here? As soon as vital systems like the circulatory system, nerve pathways, or similar are shared, the act is never physiologically exclusive because the other twin is involuntarily involved. Even if they consent, it's still an unavoidable involvement of a third person on a physical level. So that's far more than just a lack of privacy. It's a structural involvement that would actually nullify the exclusive marital act. So I find this distinction completely irrelevant here. Whether you could prove the sexual organs belong to one sister or not. Even if that's the case, they still affect the other, simply because the ovaries aren't only responsible for producing eggs, but also for hormones, and those hormones, I assume, affect both sisters here. Conversely, one sister would probably be significantly underdeveloped from a lack of female hormones if she didn't have her own ovaries. So, this distinction about whose sexual organs they are just isn't workable in the way Jimmy suggests.